In the mountains of Afghanistan, a dismissed A-10 pilot was about to defy every order she'd ever been given. What started as a routine convoy escort mission took a devastating turn when 23 civilians came face to face with a sophisticated enemy ambush. Captain Lena Roach Ramirez wasn't your typical backup pilot. For 12 years, she had spent her life mastering the art of close air support in the world's most dangerous terrain, known for her surgical precision with a GAU-8 cannon and an unshakable loyalty to troops on the ground. When she heard Sergeant Henderson's desperate radio call echoing through the hangar, "I need air support now or this convoy is gone," she had no idea she was walking into a career-ending decision that would expose the fatal flaws in modern military doctrine. Ramirez fired up her obsolete A-10 Warthog in direct violation of orders, a response that would lead to the most legendary close air support mission in recent military history. What began as institutional dismissal of an experienced pilot would become a complete transformation of Air Force training philosophy. The Pentagon would never be the same after discovering that sometimes the oldest weapons, in the hands of the most prepared warriors, could accomplish what cutting-edge technology could not. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Lena Roach Ramirez had always been invisible in the right ways. At 34, she'd logged more flight hours than pilots 10 years her senior, but she'd never been the one grabbing attention in the officers' club or trading war stories over drinks. While others cracked jokes and made flashy landings, Lena studied weather patterns until 2 a.m., and practiced emergency procedures until muscle memory took over. The briefing room at Bagram Air Base buzzed with the usual pre-mission energy. 43 aircrew members filled the sterile space, their flight suits bearing patches from a dozen different squadrons. The overhead screens flickered with mission data for Operation Safe Passage, the final phase of NATO's withdrawal from Afghanistan. Lena sat in her usual spot, second row from the back, notepad open, pen ready. Colonel Ethan Briggs strode to the front, his presence commanding immediate silence. A former F-35 test pilot with 2 combat tours, Briggs had a reputation for running tight operations and tighter crews. His eyes swept the room like a predator sizing up prey. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the big show," Briggs announced, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. 12 F-35 Lightning IIs, 4 MQ-9 Reaper drones, and 1 chance to prove we can execute flawless convoy protection in contested airspace. The Pentagon's watching, NATO's watching, screw this up, and we'll all be flying cargo runs to Greenland. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Lena didn't smile. She'd read the mission parameters 3 times already, memorized the weather forecasts, and calculated fuel burn rates for various wind conditions. This wasn't just another drill, it was a career-defining moment for everyone involved. "Primary air support assignment," Briggs continued, pointing to the main screen. "Lieutenant Tran, you'll coordinate drone surveillance. 4 Reapers, high-altitude overwatch, real-time intelligence feed." Lieutenant Chloe Pixie Tran shot to her feet with the confident grin that had made her a squadron favorite. At 26, she was everything the Air Force's PR department loved: Ivy League educated, drone qualified, and photogenic enough for recruitment posters. She'd earned her call sign not just for her petite frame, but for her ability to make complex drone operations look effortless. "Roger that, sir," Tran said, her voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. "We'll have full-spectrum surveillance and target acquisition before the convoy moves 5 clicks." Briggs nodded approvingly. F-35 escort will be Captain Morrison and Captain Walsh. High cover, stealth profile. Ready to engage any air threats that somehow get past our drone early warning network. Both pilots acknowledged with sharp nods and confident smiles. Lena waited. She'd flown the Afghan mountain corridors more times than anyone in the room. She'd perfected the delicate art of close air support in terrain where GPS signals bounced off canyon walls and where a pilot's eyes mattered more than any sensor suite. "Questions about the flight plan?" Briggs asked, scanning the room. Lena's hand went up. "Sir, what about close air support for the convoy itself? If they hit trouble in the mountain passes—" "That's what the drones are for, Captain Ramirez," Briggs interrupted, his tone dismissive. "Real-time Hellfire capability, precision targeting, zero risk to aircrew. The F-35s provide air superiority. Clean, efficient, modern." "Sir, with respect," Lena pressed, "if the convoy gets pinned in narrow terrain, drones won't have the maneuverability for danger close support. Request permission to fly my A-10 as backup CAS." The room went dead silent for a heartbeat. Then someone in the third row, she couldn't see who, let out a snort of laughter. Another pilot whispered, just loud enough for nearby seats to hear, "Museum piece much?" "Captain Ramirez," Briggs said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone reserved for pilots who didn't understand modern warfare, "the A-10 is a 40-year-old platform designed for Cold War tank battles. This is 2026. We don't need flying museum pieces when we have precision strike capabilities and stealth technology." More chuckles rippled through the room. Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her expression remained neutral. She'd heard the jokes before. Warthog, flying tank, too slow to catch a helicopter. What they didn't understand was that slow meant survivable, that loud meant enemy positions got revealed, that old meant proven. "The A-10's gun alone carries 1,100 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium," Lena said quietly. "That's more firepower than 4 Hellfires, and it doesn't rely on satellite uplinks or data streams that can be jammed." "Which is exactly why it's not suitable for this mission," Briggs shot back. "We're not carpet-bombing Afghanistan, Captain. This is surgical, minimalist, professional. Your A-10 stays grounded unless there's a catastrophic failure of all other assets." The dismissal hit her like a physical blow. Catastrophic failure of all other assets. In pilot speak, that meant, unless everyone else dies first. Lieutenant Tran turned in her seat, offering Lena what was probably meant to be a sympathetic smile. "Don't worry, Roach. If my drones can't handle it, nobody can." The casual use of her call sign from someone barely out of flight school made Lena's jaw tighten. She'd earned Roach during her first deployment when her A-10 took flak damage that should have brought down any other aircraft. She'd limped home on one engine and emergency hydraulics while her squad leader radioed ahead to prepare for a crash landing. Instead, she'd set the bird down soft as silk. Her squad said she was like a cockroach, impossible to kill and always crawling back to finish the job. Quote, "She'd hated the name at first, then she'd earned it." "Any other questions?" Briggs asked, his tone making it clear he didn't want any. Lena could have raised her hand again, could have pointed out that her last 16 performance reviews had been flawless, that she'd never failed to deliver ordnance on target, that she'd logged more accident-free close air support missions than any pilot in the squadron. Instead, she closed her notepad and stood with the rest of the crew when Briggs dismissed them. As the room emptied, she caught fragments of conversation from the other pilots. "Going to be a cakewalk with those Reapers. Hope the convoy crew can keep up. Heard Ramirez got bumped to museum duty." She walked out into the harsh Afghan sunlight, her boots silent on the concrete. The flight line stretched before her, a sea of aircraft in various stages of preparation. The F-35s gleamed in their climate-controlled hangars like expensive sports cars. The drone control station hummed with the quiet efficiency of a video game console. Her A-10 sat at the far end of the line, away from the prime spots where the primary crews were already running pre-flight checks. Nobody was watching. Nobody cared where the backup pilot parked her plane. But as Lena approached her aircraft, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not anger, not resentment, but a quiet, burning certainty. They thought she was too slow, too careful, too measured for their high-speed operation. They were about to learn the difference between fast and ready. The hangar that housed Lena's A-10 smelled like hydraulic fluid, aviation fuel, and 40 years of honest work. Master Sergeant Jonah Klein looked up from the aircraft's nose wheel as she approached, his weathered face breaking into a grin that had seen everything from Desert Storm to the current mess. "Well, well," Klein said, wiping his hands on a rag that had probably been white sometime during the Clinton administration. "Let me guess, they gave you the royal treatment in there." "Standby status," Lena said simply, "unless there's a catastrophic failure of all other assets." Klein snorted. "Catastrophic failure? Hell, Captain, that's just Tuesday in Afghanistan." He gestured toward the A-10 with obvious pride. "But they don't want the beast getting her hands dirty with actual combat, do they?" Lena walked around the aircraft, running her hands along the armored cockpit and checking the GAU-8 cannon housing. The A-10 wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. It was all angles and utility, built around the massive 30mm cannon that gave it its distinctive nose-heavy appearance. But to Lena it was perfect. Every curve had a purpose, every system had been tested in the crucible of actual combat. "Tell me you didn't just waste the morning getting her ready for nothing," Lena said. Klein's grin widened. "Funny thing about that, Captain. I might have gotten a little carried away with the pre-flight check." He led her to the aircraft's weapons pylons, where Hellfire missiles hung like deadly ornaments. "And I might have accidentally loaded a full combat package. You know how it is, muscle memory." Lena stared at him. Loading live ordnance without authorization was a court-martial offense. "Jonah. And I might have accidentally upgraded the targeting computer with some modifications I've been working on in my spare time," Klein continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Improved low-light capability, better integration with the gun system. Purely theoretical, of course. You could lose your stripes for this." Klein met her eyes. "Captain, I've been keeping these birds flying since before that drone pilot was born. I've watched Congress try to retire the A-10 6 times. I've seen fancy jets come and go, while the beast keeps doing her job. You think I'm going to let some colonel, who's never fired a shot in anger, keep the best close air support platform in the world on the ground when troops might need it?" The radio on Klein's belt crackled to life. all stations, this is Dust Off Charlie. Convoy Alpha is wheels up in 30 minutes. Final weather check shows clear skies. Light winds." Lena listened to the chatter as the convoy departed. 8 vehicles carrying UN personnel, medical supplies, and civilian evacuees. The route would take them through the Khyber Pass, winding mountain roads where an ambush could turn a convoy into a death trap in seconds. Her personal radio buzzed. "Roach, this is Sticks. You copy?" "Sergeant First Class Tariq Sticks." Henderson's voice carried the weight of too many deployments and too many close calls. Lena had flown cover for his ground operations more times than either of them could count. He was the kind of NCO who kept privates alive through their first firefight and sergeants honest about what really happened in the field. "I copy, Sticks. What's your status?" "Rolling out in 15. Heard you got benched for this one." Quote, "Standby status," Lena corrected. "I'll be monitoring from base." A pause. When Henderson's voice came back, it carried an edge she didn't like. "Roach, I've been doing this for 12 years. I can smell a bad mission from 100 clicks out. This one feels wrong. Too clean, too easy. Like someone setting up a photo op instead of planning for contact." Lena felt her stomach tighten. Henderson's instincts had kept his teams alive through 3 deployments. If he was worried, there was reason to be worried. "What's your ground truth assessment?" she asked. 8 soft-skin vehicles, minimal armor, 1 squad of infantry escort. Route takes us through 18 kilometers of perfect ambush country. We're counting on drone overwatch and F-35s that can't fly low enough to see what's actually happening down in the rocks. The intel says a lot of things, Roach. It doesn't say why we're moving a priority convoy through the worst terrain in Afghanistan with minimal security. It doesn't say why they scheduled this during peak ambush time. And it sure as hell doesn't say why they won't put the one pilot I trust on Overwatch. Klein was listening, his expression growing darker by the minute. He'd heard the same tone from ground troops before, the sound of soldiers who knew they were being set up to fail. "Sticks, you follow your orders and keep your head down," Lena said. "I'll be monitoring radio traffic." "Copy that. But Roach, if things go sideways, don't let me die out there because some colonel thinks drones are more important than pilots who give a damn." The radio went silent. Lena stared at the horizon where the convoy was already moving, a small cloud of dust disappearing into the mountains. Klein cleared his throat. "Captain, you know that the targeting computer upgrade I mentioned, it's already installed, and that weapons load, it's already armed and ready. Would be a shame to waste all that preparation." "Jonah, I can't just—" "General Mercer's bird just landed," Klein interrupted, pointing toward the VIP terminal where a Black Hawk was settling onto the tarmac. "Brass is here for the dog and pony show. Lot of cameras, lot of speeches about modern warfare and technological superiority." Lena watched as General William Mercer emerged from the helicopter, flanked by aides, and followed by a small army of photographers. The general was everything the Pentagon loved: photogenic, articulate, and completely sold on the idea that warfare was becoming a precise, technological art form. She thought about Henderson's words, about the feeling in her gut that said this mission was wrong on multiple levels. She thought about Lieutenant Tran's confidence in her drones, about the F-35 pilots who'd never flown close air support in mountain terrain, about a convoy moving through perfect kill zones with nothing but faith in technology to protect them. "How long would it take to get the beast airborne?" she asked quietly. Klein checked his watch. "She's fueled, armed, and ready. I could have you wheels up in 10 minutes. Without authorization." Without authorization. Lena looked at her A-10, then at the mountains where Henderson's convoy was disappearing into terrain that had swallowed armies for thousands of years. She thought about the difference between following orders and doing what was right, between appearing professional and being prepared. Her radio crackled again, routine chatter from the convoy as they passed the first checkpoint. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The drones were maintaining perfect surveillance. The F-35s were in position for air superiority. Everything was exactly the way Colonel Briggs had planned it, which was exactly what worried her. The first sign of trouble came 37 minutes after the convoy entered the Khyber Pass. Lena was in the hangar, ostensibly performing a routine maintenance check while actually listening to radio traffic, when Lieutenant Tran's voice cut through the routine chatter. "Base, this is Pixie. I'm showing intermittent signal loss on Reaper 2, possible atmospheric interference." Colonel Briggs's voice came back immediately. "Nature of the interference, Pixie." "Unknown, sir. Getting some kind of electronic noise across multiple frequencies. Switching to backup uplink." Lena exchanged glances with Klein. Electronic interference in the Hindu Kush wasn't unusual. The terrain played hell with radio signals, and solar activity could disrupt satellite communications. But the timing made her stomach clench. "Base, this is Styx. We're getting some chatter on enemy frequencies. Sounds like movement in the rocks above us." "Copy, Styx. Pixie, can you confirm visual on convoy route?" A pause. Then Tran's voice, no longer confident. "Negative, Base. I'm showing full signal loss on Reapers 2 and 4. Switching to optical backup." Klein was already moving toward the hangar's electrical panel. "Captain, that's not atmospheric interference. Someone's jamming their whole network." "Base, this is Styx. We're taking small arms fire from multiple positions. Request immediate air support." The radio exploded with overlapping voices. Briggs trying to coordinate a response, Tran struggling to re-establish drone contact, the F-35 pilots requesting permission to descend for a better look. Through it all, Henderson's voice stayed calm and professional, but Lena could hear the edge of desperation underneath. "Base, Styx. We're pinned in a narrow canyon. 8 vehicles, 43 personnel, including civilians. I need close air support now." "Stand by, Styx. Pixie, what's your status on re-establishing drone contact?" "Still working, sir. The jamming is sophisticated. It's targeting our specific frequencies." "Lightning 1 and 2, this is Base. Descend for visual confirmation of enemy positions." "Negative, Base. We're showing multiple SAM signatures. Looks like mobile launchers in the high ground. Request permission to engage from altitude." Lena felt the familiar cold focus that came when everything started falling apart. The convoy was trapped in exactly the kind of terrain she'd warned about. Narrow canyon walls on both sides, perfect positions for enemy fighters with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns. The drones were blind. The F-35s couldn't get low enough to provide effective support without exposing themselves to surface-to-air missiles. "Base, this is Styx. Taking casualties, need immediate medevac. Repeat, we have wounded and need immediate air support." Klein appeared at her elbow. "Captain, the beast is ready." "I don't have authorization." "You have a ground unit taking fire and no effective air support." "That's all the authorization you need." On the radio, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The F-35s had tried one high-altitude pass, but couldn't positively identify enemy positions without descending into the SAM envelope. Tran was still struggling with the jamming, and Henderson's reports were getting more urgent. "Base, Styx, we're down to 2 vehicles still mobile. Taking heavy machine gun fire from positions in the rocks. Whatever you're going to do it now." Quote, Lena closed her eyes and saw Henderson's face. A good NCO who'd kept his soldiers alive through too many deployments to die because someone thought technology was more important than experience. She thought about the civilians in that convoy, aid workers and interpreters who trusted NATO to get them out safely. She thought about the difference between following orders and following her oath. "Jonah, fire her up!" Klein was already moving. "On it, Captain!" The A-10's engines spooled up with their distinctive howl, a sound that had brought hope to ground troops and terror to enemies for 4 decades. Lena ran through her pre-flight checklist with the speed of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, her hands moving automatically across controls and switches. "Base, this is Roach. Request immediate takeoff clearance for emergency close air support." "Negative, Roach. You are not cleared for." "Base, this is Styx. I don't care who's flying what. I need air support now, or this convoy is gone." Lena's hand hovered over the throttle. Taking off without clearance was a career-ending move. Disobeying direct orders in a combat zone could result in court-martial and prison time. But on the radio, she could hear Henderson coordinating his remaining vehicle's defense, could hear the fear creeping into even his professional voice. She thought about Lieutenant Tran, struggling with jammed drones while good people died. She thought about the F-35 pilots, circling uselessly at altitude, while the real fight happened in the rocks below. She thought about Colonel Briggs, probably screaming at his staff to find a technological solution to a human problem. "Klein, you better hope your upgrades work." "They'll work, Captain. You just do what you do best." Lena pushed the throttles forward and felt the beast surge toward the runway. No tower clearance. No flight plan. No authorization from anyone who mattered. Just a pilot and her aircraft, heading toward a fight that everyone else had deemed too dangerous or too dirty for modern warfare. Behind her, she could hear Klein on the radio. "Base, this is maintenance. Be advised that A-10 tail number 80148 is experiencing radio malfunction and may not respond to ground control." It was a transparent lie that would buy her maybe 10 minutes before Briggs figured out what was happening. But 10 minutes might be enough to reach Henderson's position and turn the tide. The A-10 lifted off into the thin mountain air, its titanium bathtub cockpit and redundant systems designed for exactly this kind of mission. As Lena banked toward the mountains, she could see smoke rising from the Khyber Pass where the convoy was fighting for its life. She switched to Henderson's frequency. "Styx, this is Roach. I'm inbound. 5 minutes out. Give me a ground truth assessment." "Roach?" Henderson's voice carried a mixture of relief and disbelief. "How the hell did you—" "Never mind. We're in a box canyon. Enemy positions on both sides about 200 meters up. They've got RPGs, heavy machine guns, and at least 1 recoilless rifle. 3 vehicles destroyed, multiple casualties, civilians pinned in the center vehicle." "Copy. Can you mark your position?" "Negative on smoke. They'll target it. But we're the only idiots dumb enough to be driving around in this canyon right now." Lena smiled grimly as the mountains rose around her. The A-10 was designed for this low, slow, dirty fighting where pilot skill mattered more than sensor arrays. She could see the canyon ahead, a narrow scar in the mountainside where smoke and dust marked the battle. "Styx, keep your heads down. The cavalry's coming, and she's got very big guns." The radio crackled with Briggs's voice, finally realizing what had happened. "All stations, A-10 tail number 80148 is not authorized for this mission. Roach, return to base immediately." Lena reached over and switched off her radio. Some conversations could wait. Below, she could see the convoy, battered vehicles scattered across the canyon floor like broken toys, enemy muzzle flashes winking from positions that would have been invisible to high-altitude surveillance. It was exactly the kind of close-quarters, danger-close combat that had made the A-10 legendary. Time to remind everyone why they called her Roach. The Khyber Pass opened before Lena like the gates of hell, carved from living rock by centuries of wind and the passage of armies. She dropped the beast to 300 feet, skimming the canyon walls with the kind of precision that made other pilots nervous just watching. The A-10's twin engines howled their defiant song, echoing off stone walls that had witnessed the death of empires. "Styx, Roach is in the area. I need you to pop smoke on the friendlies so I can sort out who's who down there." "Copy, Roach. Smoke out in 10 seconds, purple smoke marking our position." Quote, Lena banked hard left, feeling the A-10 respond like the heavyweight fighter it was. Not graceful, but absolutely committed to whatever direction she pointed it. Below, the convoy spread across the canyon floor like a military autopsy. 3 vehicles were burning wrecks, their blackened hulks testimony to the effectiveness of rocket-propelled grenades in narrow terrain. The remaining 5 were clustered behind whatever cover they could find. Boulders, overturned trucks, the scattered remains of their escort. Purple smoke blossomed from the center of the defensive position. Around it, Lena could see the convoy personnel, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, huddled behind inadequate cover while enemy fire poured down from positions invisible to satellite surveillance, but crystal clear to a pilot willing to fly low enough to see the muzzle flashes. Sticks. I count at least 12 enemy positions in the rocks. Heavy machine guns at 2 and 10 o'clock from your position. RPG teams scattered along both ridges. Someone down there has been planning this party for a while. Copy that, Roach. Can you do something about our uninvited guests? Lena smiled grimly and armed the GAU-8 cannon. The A-10 had been built around this gun, literally. Every other system on the aircraft existed to support 30 millimeters of depleted uranium death delivered at 3,900 rounds per minute. When the Air Force had designed the plane, they'd started with the gun and built an aircraft around it. Sticks, keep everyone's heads down. I'm going to make some noise. She rolled the A-10 into a shallow dive, lining up on a machine gun position that had been hammering the convoy from an outcropping about halfway up the eastern wall. The enemy gunners probably thought they were safe, high enough to avoid ground fire, concealed enough to avoid aerial detection. They'd never dealt with a pilot crazy enough to thread an attack aircraft through a narrow canyon at strafing speed. The targeting reticles settled on the rocky outcropping where muzzle flashes betrayed the enemy position. Lena squeezed the trigger, and the beast bucked as the GAU-8 came alive. The sound was indescribable, like God himself clearing his throat. 1,100 rounds of depleted uranium core ammunition, each one capable of punching through tank armor, poured into the rocks at a rate that turned individual bullets into a continuous stream of destruction. The machine gun position simply ceased to exist. Where seconds before there had been an effective fighting position, now there was only pulverized stone and silence. Holy shit, Roach! Henderson's voice carried a mixture of awe and relief. That was surgical. But Lena was already lining up her next target, an RPG team that had been working its way around the convoy's flank. The A-10's nose swung toward the new threat, with the inexorable precision of divine judgment. Another burst from the cannon, another enemy position erased from existence. The canyon erupted with return fire. AK-47s chattering from a dozen positions, a recoilless rifle booming from somewhere high on the western wall, the distinctive whoosh of RPG streaking toward her aircraft. The A-10 shrugged off the small arms fire. Its titanium bathtub cockpit and redundant systems had been designed specifically for this kind of punishment. But the heavier weapons were a different story. Roach, you've got RPGs tracking you, Henderson called out. Lena didn't answer. She was too busy proving why the A-10 was called the Warthog. She pulled the aircraft into a climb that would have stalled any other plane at this altitude, trading airspeed for angle as an RPG streaked past her starboard wing. At the top of the climb, she rolled, inverted, and dove back toward the canyon floor, using the stone walls themselves as cover while she repositioned for another attack run. Base, this is Lightning 1. We're showing an A-10 operating in the target area without authorization. Request clarification. Briggs's voice cut through the tactical frequency like a rusty blade. Lightning 1, that aircraft is not authorized for combat operations. Do not provide support. Lena keyed her radio long enough to respond. Lightning 1, this is Roach. Unless you're planning to fly down here and help, I suggest you stay at altitude and let the grown-ups work. She killed the radio again and concentrated on the tactical problem. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly for a conventional ambush, but they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed their targets would be helpless once pinned in the canyon. They hadn't planned for an A-10 pilot willing to turn their carefully prepared kill zone into her own personal shooting gallery. Another gun run, this time targeting a recoilless rifle position that had been bracketing the convoy with increasingly accurate fire. The GAU-8 spoke again. Its voice, the sound of civilization's most advanced technology applied to humanity's oldest profession. When the dust cleared, the recoilless rifle was scrap metal scattered across 100 meters of mountainside. "Roach, you beautiful crazy bitch, keep it up!" This from one of the convoy drivers, his radio discipline forgotten in the heat of the moment. "Sticks, what's your casualty status?" Lena asked as she set up for another pass. 4 KIA, 8 wounded, 3 critical. We've got a UN liaison down here coordinating civilian evacuees, Major Dawood. She's been keeping the non-combatants calm, but we need to get them out of here soon. Major Amina Dawood. Lena had read the briefing files. Egyptian-born UN worker, former military medic, decorated for her work in Syrian refugee camps. She was supposed to be coordinating the evacuation of local interpreters and their families, people who'd risked everything to help NATO forces and now needed protection from Taliban reprisals. "Copy that, Sticks. Tell Major Dawood that the cavalry's here, and we don't leave anyone behind." Lena rolled into another attack run, this time targeting a cluster of enemy fighters who'd been trying to work their way down from the high ground. The A-10's cannon was running low. She'd burned through almost half her ammunition in the first few passes, but there were still plenty of enemies to kill. The radio crackled with a new voice, calm and professional despite the chaos around her. "Aircraft providing close air support. This is Major Dawood. I have 23 civilians in the center vehicle, including 5 children. Can you guarantee their safety during extraction?" Lena felt something twist in her chest. 5 children, probably no older than her nephew back in Texas, trapped in a metal box while bullets sparked off the rocks around them. This was why she'd joined the Air Force, why she'd spent 12 years perfecting the art of close air support. Not for medals or promotions or the approval of colonels who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, but for moments like this when being good at her job meant the difference between life and death for people who deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt. "Major Dawood, this is Captain Ramirez. I've been keeping people alive in places like this for longer than I care to remember. Those children are going home to their families, and that's a promise." Quote, another enemy position revealed itself as an RPG streaked toward the convoy. Lena marked the launch point and dove toward it, the A-10 responding to her inputs with the loyalty of a well-trained warhorse. The cannon spoke again, and another group of enemy fighters discovered the difference between cover and concealment. But even as she worked methodically through the enemy positions, Lena could see that this was more than a simple ambush. The enemy had sophisticated equipment, not just AK-47s and RPGs, but modern radios, night vision equipment, and what looked like man-portable air defense systems. Someone had planned this operation carefully, and they'd brought enough firepower to handle more than just a lightly defended convoy. "Sticks, how many more are out there?" "Unknown, Roach. We're still taking fire from at least 6 positions, and I think there's more movement in the high rocks." This wasn't some random Taliban patrol. Someone set this up specifically. Lena filed that information away for later analysis. Right now, the tactical situation was clear. Friendly forces pinned in indefensible terrain, enemy forces in prepared positions with superior numbers and firepower advantage. In the textbooks, this was the kind of scenario that called for immediate withdrawal or massive supporting fires. But the textbooks hadn't been written by A-10 pilots. "Major Dawood, I need you to coordinate movement of the civilians to the most defensible vehicle. When I clear the next enemy position, you'll have maybe 60 seconds before they reposition. Can you make that happen?" "Affirmative, Captain." "The children are frightened, but they trust me. We'll be ready." Lena pulled into another climb, scanning the ridgelines for her next target. The enemy was adapting too. They'd stopped firing from fixed positions and were using fire and move tactics that made them harder to spot. But adaptation worked both ways. She'd been playing this game longer than most of them had been alive. Time to show them why experienced pilots were worth more than all the drones in the world. The A-10 carved through the mountain air like a mechanical angel of death, its distinctive silhouette casting shadows on the canyon walls below. Lena had dropped to just above stall speed, slower than most helicopters dared to fly, turning the aircraft into a methodical instrument of precision violence that could loiter over the battlefield and deliver ordnance with surgical accuracy. "Base, this is Lightning 2. The A-10 is operating in violation of direct orders. Request permission to force compliance." Captain Morrison's voice carried the kind of by-the-book authority that had probably impressed his instructors at the Air Force Academy. Lena almost felt sorry for him, a good pilot trapped by regulations and hierarchy while people died on the ground below. "Lightning 2, this is Roach." You want to try to force compliance on an A-10 that's configured for air-to-air combat? She keyed the radio just long enough to deliver the message, then switched back to Henderson's frequency. No point in prolonging the conversation with pilots who couldn't help anyway. The tactical situation was evolving rapidly. Enemy reinforcements were moving through the high rocks. She could see them repositioning, bringing up what looked like a more sophisticated air defense system. But the convoy's immediate threats were being systematically eliminated by the GAU-8's devastating effectiveness. Major Dawood, this is Roach. I need you to take over coordination of ground movement. Styx is busy keeping the perimeters secure. Copy, Captain Ramirez. What do you need from us? Amina Dawood's voice carried the calm professionalism of someone who'd worked in war zones long enough to know that panic was a luxury nobody could afford. Lena found herself respecting the woman she'd never met. It took a special kind of courage to keep civilians calm while bullets were flying overhead. I'm going to clear the western ridge in sections, moving from north to south. Each time I engage, I need you to move your civilians closer to the southern extraction point. Think of it as covering fire for a very slow-motion assault. Understood. How long do we have for each movement? Lena banked into position for another gun run, studying the enemy positions with the eye of someone who'd made a career out of close air support. The Taliban fighters, and she was increasingly convinced these weren't just Taliban, had dug in well. But they'd made the classic mistake of preparing for the war they expected instead of the war they got. You'll have about 90 seconds between my gun runs. After that, they'll have repositioned and started shooting again. Use the time wisely. The GAU-8 spoke again, its voice the sound of American engineering applied to the ancient art of war. Another enemy position ceased to exist, reduced to rubble and silence by 1,100 rounds of depleted uranium. The recoil from the massive cannon actually slowed the A-10's forward progress, a phenomenon that pilots joked about, but engineers had actually calculated into the aircraft's design specifications. Movement! Movement! Dawood's voice cut through the radio chatter as she coordinated the civilian evacuation. Children first, then wounded, then everyone else. Stay low, stay together, and don't stop until you reach the rocks. Lena could see the small group of figures moving across the canyon floor. Civilians in traditional Afghan clothing mixed with aid workers in practical Western gear, all of them bent low as they scurried between whatever cover they could find. At the center of the group, a woman in dusty khakis was orchestrating the movement with hand signals and quiet commands that somehow carried over the chaos of combat. Major Amina Dawood, keeping her people alive through leadership and force of will, Lena made a mental note to buy the woman a drink if they all survived this clusterfuck. Roach, you've got movement on the eastern ridge. Looks like they're bringing up something big. Henderson's warning came just as Lena spotted the threat, a team of fighters manhandling what looked like a Soviet-era SA-18 surface-to-air missile system up the rocky slope. Shoulder-fired, heat-seeking, and perfectly capable of turning an A-10 into a fireball if they got a clean shot. I see them, Styx. Time to explain why the A-10 has more flares than any other aircraft in the inventory. She rolled into a dive that would have made any sane pilot reconsider his career choices, dropping toward the SAM team at an angle that gave them minimal tracking time. The missile system was sophisticated, but it still required a human operator to acquire and lock onto targets. And humans, unlike computers, could be intimidated. The GAU-8 erupted in a sustained burst that lasted nearly 3 seconds, an eternity in air-to-ground combat. When the dust settled, the SAM team had been scattered across 50 meters of mountainside, their equipment reduced to expensive scrap metal. Jesus Christ, Roach! This from one of the convoy drivers. How the hell do you fly that thing so low without hitting the rocks? Practice, Lena replied, already scanning for her next target. Lots and lots of practice. But even as she worked through the enemy positions with methodical efficiency, she could feel the tactical situation shifting. The enemy wasn't just adapting. They were bringing up reinforcements and heavier weapons. What had started as a simple ambush was turning into a sustained battle. And the A-10's ammunition load wasn't infinite. Major Dawood, what's your status on civilian evacuation? We've moved 15 civilians to the southern rally point. 8 more to go, including 3 wounded who require assistance. Captain, I have to ask, how long can you maintain air support? It was a professional question that deserved a professional answer. Lena checked her fuel and ammunition status, calculating the mathematics of modern combat. She had maybe 20 minutes of loiter time left, enough ammunition for 3 more sustained gun runs, and an increasingly sophisticated enemy that was adapting to her tactics. "Long enough," she said simply. "Keep moving your people." But as she lined up for another attack run, her radio crackled with a new voice, Colonel Briggs, and he sounded like a man whose carefully planned operation was falling apart in real time. "All stations, this is base. A-10 tail number 80148 is operating without authorization and in violation of direct orders. Any pilot providing assistance to this aircraft will face court-martial proceedings." The threat hung in the air like cordite smoke. Lena wasn't surprised. Briggs was covering his ass while good people died, protecting his career while the mission he'd planned fell apart in the mountains. But what surprised her was Henderson's response. "Base, this is Styx. I don't know what A-10 you're talking about. All I see is an angel with a very big gun, and she's the only thing keeping my people alive. If you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with me when I get back." "Styx, this is Major Dawood. I concur with Sergeant Henderson's assessment. The aircraft providing close air support has saved multiple civilian lives. Any disciplinary action should wait until after mission completion." One by one, other voices joined the chorus. The convoy drivers, the medical personnel, even some of the wounded were keying their radios to express support for the unauthorized close air support that was keeping them alive. It was a level of solidarity that transcended military hierarchy and bureaucratic politics. Soldiers and civilians, united by the simple recognition that some things mattered more than following orders. Lena felt her throat tighten. She'd spent 12 years flying missions where her contribution was measured in after-action reports and efficiency ratings. This was the first time she'd ever heard troops on the ground explicitly defending her right to be there. "All stations, this is Roach. Maintain radio discipline and focus on the mission. We've got civilians to evacuate and bad guys to kill. Everything else can wait until later." She rolled into another gun run, this time targeting a mortar position that had been dropping rounds dangerously close to the civilian rally point. The A-10's cannon spoke with its distinctive voice, and another enemy position was reduced to silence and rubble. But as she pulled out of the dive, her threat warning system started screaming. Someone down there had just locked onto her aircraft with a missile guidance system more sophisticated than anything the Taliban should have possessed. All stations, this is Roach. I'm being painted by fire control radar. Someone down there has serious hardware." The implications hit her immediately. This wasn't just a Taliban ambush. This was a carefully planned operation using military-grade equipment that had been positioned specifically to target NATO aircraft. Someone had known about the convoy route, known about the timing, and prepared accordingly. Which meant this entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. "Major Dawood, how many more civilians need to be moved?" 5, including 2 children who are too frightened to move quickly. Lena checked her ammunition counter and fuel status. She had enough for maybe 2 more gun runs, and the enemy was bringing up increasingly sophisticated weapons. The smart tactical decision would be to withdraw now, while she still had enough fuel to make it back to base safely. But those 2 children weren't making tactical decisions. They were just trying to survive in a world where grown-ups had failed to keep them safe. "Copy that, Major. We're not leaving without them." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The radar lock dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, but Lena knew what it meant. Somewhere in the rocks below, enemy forces were setting up more sophisticated air defense systems than intelligence had predicted. The mission briefing had mentioned small arms and RPGs, maybe some improvised explosive devices. It hadn't said anything about modern surface-to-air missiles or the kind of electronic warfare equipment that could jam NATO communications. "Base, this is Roach. Be advised, enemy forces are equipped with advanced air defense systems and electronic warfare capabilities. This is not a simple Taliban ambush." Silence from Colonel Briggs. Either he was processing the implications of having walked a convoy into a sophisticated trap, or he was trying to figure out how to blame the intelligence failure on someone else. Lena suspected it was the latter. "Roach, this is Major Dawood. We've got a problem down here." One of the children, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, she's hiding under one of the damaged vehicles and won't come out. Her brother is trying to coax her, but she's too scared to move. Lena could see the situation developing through her optics. A small figure huddled beneath the twisted wreckage of what had been a cargo truck, while an older boy knelt nearby trying to reach her. Around them, the adults were maintaining a defensive perimeter, but their position was increasingly exposed as enemy forces repositioned for another assault. "Can you carry her out?" "Negative. The vehicle is too unstable. If we try to extract her by force, the whole thing could collapse. And we're taking sniper fire from the eastern ridge. Anyone who approaches that vehicle for more than a few seconds is going to be a target." Lena studied the tactical problem with the cold focus that had kept her alive through 12 years of combat flying. The sniper was positioned approximately 800 meters away, using the rocky terrain to mask his position between shots. Standard counter-sniper tactics called for indirect fires or precision bombing to neutralize the threat. But the A-10's GAU-8 cannon wasn't a precision instrument. It was an area weapon designed to destroy tank formations, not surgical tool for eliminating individual threats. A miss by even a few meters could bring down tons of rock on the trapped child. "Major DeWood, I need you to mark the sniper's position with whatever you have. Smoke, flare, anything that will help me see exactly where he's shooting from." "Copy. Give me 30 seconds. Lena used the time to set up for the most difficult shot of her career. She would have one chance. The sniper would relocate immediately after she fired, and the child couldn't stay under that unstable vehicle much longer. Miss the target, and a 6-year-old girl would die because an A-10 pilot thought she was more precise than physics allowed. Hit the target too close to the vehicle, and the same child would die under an avalanche of rock and metal." A red flare arced up from the convoy's position, marking the approximate location of the sniper's nest. Lena could see the position now. A natural hide among the rocks, perfectly positioned to cover the convoy's location, but vulnerable to attack from above. She rolled into the shallowest diving attack profile of her career, bringing the A-2 nose to bear on a target that seemed impossibly small when viewed through the aircraft's gun sight. The GAU-8's targeting reticle settled on the rocky outcropping, and Lena held her breath as she calculated wind, distance, and the ballistic trajectory of depleted uranium shells. One burst. 3 seconds of firing. Either she eliminated the threat precisely enough to save the child, or she created a catastrophe that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The cannon spoke with its distinctive voice, but this time Lena had fired the shortest burst of her career, just enough rounds to eliminate the target without collapsing half the mountainside. When the dust settled, the sniper's position was silent. "Roach, that was beautiful! The sniper's down and the girl is moving." Lena allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of relief before refocusing on the larger tactical picture. The enemy was adapting faster than she'd expected, bringing up reinforcements and repositioning their remaining forces to counter her attack patterns. What worried her most was the sophistication of their equipment. This level of coordination and technology suggested either foreign backing or access to military stockpiles that intelligence hadn't accounted for. "Major Dawood, how much longer do you need for complete evacuation?" 10 minutes, maybe 15. We've got 3 civilians who need medical assistance, and one of our vehicles is still operational but needs time to get everyone loaded. Lena checked her fuel and ammunition status. 10 minutes was pushing the envelope. She had enough fuel to remain on station, but her ammunition was running dangerously low. More concerning was the increasing level of enemy activity she could see through her targeting system. New groups of fighters were moving through the high rocks, bringing what looked like additional air defense systems. "Base, this is Roach. Request immediate resupply and backup close air support for ongoing rescue operation." "Negative, Roach. Return to base immediately for disciplinary action." Briggs's voice carried the brittle authority of an officer who'd lost control of the situation and was trying to regain it through threats. Lena almost felt sorry for him. His carefully planned, technology-dependent operation had fallen apart the moment it encountered reality, and now he was reduced to threatening the one pilot who was actually accomplishing the mission. "Base, this is Major Dawood. Be advised that civilian evacuation is not complete. Withdrawal of close air support at this time would result in civilian casualties." "Major, you are not authorized to make tactical decisions regarding air support. The A-10 will return to base immediately." Lena keyed her radio just long enough to deliver a message that would probably end her military career. "Base, this is Roach. I'm going to stay here and do my job. You can court-martial me when I get back." assuming any of us survive long enough for that to matter. She switched off her radio and focused on the tactical situation. Without resupply or backup, she was facing an increasingly well-equipped enemy force with diminishing resources. The smart play was to withdraw now, while she still had enough fuel and ammunition to fight her way out if necessary. But smart plays were for pilots who cared more about their own survival than the lives of the people depending on them. Major Dawood, this is Roach on your local frequency. I'm staying until everyone is out, but we need to accelerate the timeline. How quickly can you get the remaining civilians to the extraction point? Give me 5 minutes, Captain. We'll make it work. Lena rolled into another attack pattern, this time targeting a machine gun position that had been suppressing the convoy's movement. The GAU-8 spoke again, but she could hear the difference in its voice, the distinctive sound that meant her ammunition supply was running critically low. After this engagement, she would have enough rounds for maybe one more sustained burst. After that, the A-10 would be reduced to its psychological effect and whatever creative tactics she could improvise with an unarmed aircraft. The machine gun position disappeared in a cloud of pulverized rock and shattered equipment. But even as she celebrated the successful engagement, her threat warning system screamed another missile lock. This time, the signal was stronger and more persistent. Someone had finally brought a serious surface-to-air missile system into position. All stations, this is Roach. I'm being painted by Sam Radar. If anyone has any bright ideas, now would be a good time to share them. The radio crackled with Henderson's voice. Roach, we see the launcher. It's mobile, moving between positions on the northern ridge. Can you engage? Lena studied the threat through her targeting system. The SAM launcher was exactly the kind of target the A-10 had been designed to kill, mobile, dangerous, and protected by terrain that made conventional bombing difficult. But engaging it would require her to fly directly into its engagement envelope, risking everything on a single gun run with her remaining ammunition. Miss the target, and she would be flying an unarmed aircraft against increasingly sophisticated enemy forces. Hit the target, and she might have just enough fuel to cover the final phase of the evacuation before heading home. Assuming there was a home to head to, given that she'd just told a full colonel to go to hell over an open radio frequency. Major Dawood, get those civilians moving. I'm going to clear the road home. She rolled the A-10 into the steepest dive of her career, committing everything to a single attack run that would either eliminate the SAM threat or turn her into a fireball somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan. The missile launcher grew larger in her targeting reticle as she dove toward it. The enemy operators probably calculating their own engagement envelope and wondering if they could get a shot off before the A-10's cannon reached them. It was going to be very close. The surface-to-air missile launcher sat on a rocky plateau like a mechanical praying mantis, its radar dish rotating slowly as it searched for targets. Lena could see the crew scrambling around the system. Probably 4 men, maybe 5. All of them working frantically to lock onto the A-10 that was diving straight toward them at attack speed. It was the kind of target engagement that pilots trained for in simulators but rarely encountered in actual combat, a mutual kill scenario where success depended on whose weapon system fired first and whose aim was more accurate. The SAM launcher had the advantage of range and sophisticated guidance systems. The A-10 had the advantage of pilot skill and the GAU-8's devastating effectiveness. Assuming Lena could get close enough to use it, the threat warning system in her cockpit was screaming constantly now, indicating that the enemy radar had achieved a solid lock on her aircraft. Somewhere below, a missile operator was probably squeezing his trigger, sending a heat-seeking projectile toward the A-10's engine exhausts at 3 times the speed of sound. Lena counted down the seconds in her head. 5 more seconds until she reached minimum engagement range for the cannon. 4 more seconds until the missile's flight time would make evasion impossible. 3 more seconds until she either eliminated the threat or died trying. At 2 seconds, she fired. The GAU-8 erupted in its longest sustained burst of the entire engagement, pouring every remaining round of depleted uranium ammunition into the SAM launcher and its crew. The recoil actually caused the A-10 to decelerate in mid-air, the massive cannon acting like a retrograde rocket that fought against the aircraft's forward momentum. The missile launcher disappeared in a cloud of smoke, dust, and scattered metal, but even as Lena pulled out of her dive, she could see the white contrail of a surface-to-air missile streaking upward from a secondary position she hadn't spotted, a backup launcher that had been hidden in the rocks, waiting for exactly this moment. Shit! The word came out as a prayer, a curse, and a technical assessment all rolled into one. The missile was closing fast, its heat-seeking warhead locked onto the A-10's engine signature. Lena pulled the aircraft into a climb that would have stalled any other plane at this altitude, trading airspeed for angle while she pumped chaff and flares into the thin mountain air. The countermeasures created a constellation of false targets around the A-10, each one designed to confuse and distract incoming missiles. For a moment, it looked like the defensive systems would work. The missile wavered in its trajectory, momentarily confused by the cloud of metallic strips and infrared decoys surrounding the aircraft. But modern SAMs were designed to overcome exactly these kinds of countermeasures, and after a brief hesitation, the warhead reacquired its target. The explosion, when it came, felt like being hit by a freight train. The missile detonated just behind and below the A-10's starboard wing, its proximity fuse triggered by the aircraft's radar signature. Shrapnel from the warhead peppered the aircraft's armored belly and wing surfaces, punching holes through control surfaces and severing hydraulic lines that bled precious fluid into the thin mountain air. Lena felt the aircraft shudder and yaw as primary flight controls failed. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel like a Christmas tree designed by sadists. Hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems failing, fuel leak in the starboard wing tank. The A-10 was hurt, badly hurt, but it was still flying. Barely. Base, all stations, this is Roach. I've taken a hit and lost primary hydraulics. Aircraft is flyable but degraded. Continuing mission. Roach, this is Major Dawood. Are you all right? Lena took quick inventory of her situation. The A-10 was responding to control inputs, but sluggishly, like a heavyweight boxer who'd taken too many hits to the head. She could maintain level flight, but complex maneuvering was becoming increasingly difficult as hydraulic fluid continued to leak from damaged systems. More concerning was the fuel situation. The missile hit had apparently damaged the starboard wing tank. She could see jet fuel streaming behind the aircraft like a silver contrail. At current consumption rates, she had maybe 15 minutes of flight time remaining. I'm fine, Major. What's your status on civilian evacuation? Last group is moving now. 2 minutes to complete extraction, then we can begin convoy withdrawal. 2 minutes. Lena could maintain station for 2 minutes, even with damaged flight controls and a fuel leak that was turning her aircraft into a very expensive glider. But the enemy wasn't going to give them 2 minutes of peace. She could already see movement in the rocks as surviving fighters repositioned for a final assault on the evacuation point. Without ammunition for the GAU-8, she was reduced to psychological warfare and whatever creative tactics she could improvise with a damaged aircraft. But sometimes, in the strange mathematics of combat, the threat of violence was almost as effective as violence itself. She dropped the A-10 to just above the canyon floor, flying directly over the enemy positions at an altitude that would have been considered reckless even for a helicopter. The aircraft's distinctive silhouette and the howl of its twin engines had a psychological effect that years of combat had proven. Enemy fighters who might stand and fight against distant bombers would often break and run when an A-10 appeared directly overhead. Roach, you're leaking fuel badly. You need to get out of there. Henderson's voice carried the concern of a ground soldier who'd watched too many aircraft go down in flames. But Lena was calculating different mathematics, not the probability of her own survival, but the certainty that abandoning the evacuation now would result in civilian casualties. Sticks, how much longer? 30 seconds. The last kids are getting into the vehicle now. 30 seconds. She could maintain flight for 30 more seconds, even if the starboard engine decided to quit from fuel starvation. The A-10 had been designed to fly home on one engine, to absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft, to keep fighting even when rational aircraft would have given up and gone home. But as she circled the evacuation point one last time, her starboard engine coughed and died. The fuel leak had finally overcome the wing tank's capacity, and half her propulsion had just become expensive dead weight. The A-10 shuddered and began to descend, its remaining engine struggling to maintain altitude in the thin mountain air. All stations, this is Roach. I've lost an engine and I'm running on fumes, beginning emergency landing procedures. Roach, negative, the landing zone is still hot. But Lena was already committed to the emergency landing, whether she wanted to be or not. The A-10 was settling toward the canyon floor with the inexorable descent of a wounded bird, its single remaining engine barely providing enough thrust to control the rate of descent. She had maybe 30 seconds to find a piece of relatively flat ground in a canyon that consisted primarily of rocks, boulders, and the scattered wreckage of earlier battles. It was the kind of landing that test pilots practiced on computer simulators and hoped never to attempt in real life. The dry wash at the southern end of the canyon looked like her best option, a relatively flat stretch of sand and gravel that might, with considerable luck and a minimum of divine intervention, be long enough to stop an A-10 without killing its pilot. Major Dawood, this is Roach. Get those civilians out of here. I'm coming down whether I want to or not. Copy, Captain. And Lena? Thank you. Quote, the use of her first name, calm and deliberate despite the chaos around them, hit Lena harder than she'd expected. She'd been Roach for so long that hearing her actual name spoken with gratitude and respect reminded her why she'd become a pilot in the first place. The A-10 touched down in the dry wash at approximately twice the recommended landing speed, its landing gear absorbing the impact with the grudging tolerance of equipment designed by engineers who understood that military aircraft sometimes had to operate outside normal parameters. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled into a ground roll that seemed to last forever. When it finally stopped, Lena was alive, conscious, and sitting in an intact cockpit approximately 3 kilometers from the convoy's extraction point. Around her, the A-10's engines ticked and cooled in the sudden silence, and she could hear small arms fire in the distance as the convoy fought its way toward safety. She keyed her radio one last time. All stations, this is Roach. I'm down but not out. Continue mission, and somebody tell Klein that the beast earned her keep today. In the distance, she could see dust clouds rising from the convoy's route as they carried 23 civilians toward safety. 5 children, 18 adults, all of them alive because an A-10 pilot had been willing to disobey orders and do her job. It had been a good day's work. The command center at Bagram Air Base had descended into barely controlled chaos. Colonel Briggs stood before a bank of monitors showing scattered signals from the convoy's retreat, drone feeds that flickered in and out of electronic interference, and one conspicuously blank screen that had been tracking A-10 tail number 80148 until it disappeared from radar 17 minutes ago. Sir, we're still not getting any response from Roach on any frequency, reported the communication specialist, his voice tight with the kind of stress that came from watching a pilot go down in hostile territory. Lieutenant Chloe Tran sat at her drone control station, her hands clenched in fists as she stared at screens showing static where her Reaper feeds should have been. The sophisticated surveillance network that was supposed to provide total battlefield awareness had been systematically jammed and destroyed by an enemy force that intelligence had dismissed as, quote, technologically primitive. Can we get any eyes on her crash site? Tran asked, her voice barely controlled. Negative, Briggs replied, his tone carrying the brittle authority of an officer whose carefully planned operation had fallen apart in real time. The area is still hot and we don't have assets available for search and rescue. What do you mean we don't have assets? Tran shot to her feet, her composure finally cracking. She's down there because she was doing the job we were supposed to do. Because our drones got jammed and our F-35s couldn't fly low enough to help. General Mercer, who had been conspicuously silent since the operation began falling apart, finally spoke. Lieutenant, Captain Ramirez disobeyed direct orders and operated outside authorized parameters. She assumed the risks of unauthorized combat operations. The words hung in the air like cordite smoke. Tran stared at the general for a long moment, her expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked suspiciously like disgust. Sir, with all due respect, she saved 23 civilians and got the convoy out alive when our authorized parameters failed completely. If that's grounds for disciplinary action, then maybe our parameters are wrong. Briggs's face flushed red. Lieutenant Tran, you are way out of line. Base, this is Styx. Do you copy? Henderson's voice cut through the tension in the command center like a blade. Everyone turned toward the communications console as the signal resolved into clarity. Styx, this is Base. What's your status? We're clear of the kill zone, all civilians accounted for. 23 souls delivered safe, including 5 kids who are going to grow up because an A-10 pilot decided orders were less important than lives. The rebuke was subtle but unmistakable. Briggs opened his mouth to respond, but Henderson wasn't finished. Base, be advised that we have multiple KIA and WIA but 0 civilian casualties. Mission success is directly attributable to close air support provided by Captain Ramirez. Also be advised that we observed her aircraft make what appeared to be a controlled emergency landing approximately 3 kilometers south of the extraction point. The command center erupted in overlapping voices. Controlled landing? Is she alive? Can we get assets to her position? Henderson's voice cut through the chatter. Unknown on pilot status, but the aircraft appeared intact when we lost visual. Requesting immediate search and rescue authorization. Quote. Briggs hesitated, probably calculating the political ramifications of authorizing a rescue mission for a pilot who'd disobeyed direct orders. But before he could respond, Tran was moving toward the door. Where are you going, Lieutenant? To get my F-35 airborne and provide overwatch for search and rescue, sir, with or without authorization. You are not authorized. Colonel, with respect, I don't care. Tran's voice carried the cold fury of someone who'd watched political calculation override military necessity once too often. Captain Ramirez risked everything to save those civilians when our technology failed. If you think I'm going to let her die in the mountains because of paperwork, you don't know me very well. General Mercer stepped forward, his expression calculating. Lieutenant, stand down. You're letting emotion override professional judgment. No, sir, I'm letting professional judgment override institutional cowardice. The words hit the command center like a physical blow. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Klein's voice crackled over the radio from the maintenance hangar. Base, this is maintenance. Be advised that we're receiving an emergency beacon signal from A-10 tail number 80148. GPS coordinates are being transmitted now. Hope flared in the command center like a struck match. Emergency beacons meant the pilot was alive, or at least that the aircraft's survival systems were functioning. But even as the coordinates appeared on the main screen, everyone could see the tactical problem. Lena's position was still well within enemy territory, surrounded by the same terrain that had made the original convoy evacuation so difficult. Base, this is Henderson. My vehicles are approximately 8 kilometers from Captain Ramirez's position. Request permission to divert for personnel recovery. Negative, Sticks. Your priority is getting those civilians to safety. We'll coordinate separate recovery operations. But even as Briggs spoke, they all knew the mathematics of the situation. Any rescue mission would require air cover, medical support, and significant logistical coordination. By the time all the authorizations were processed and assets were positioned, it might be too late. Tran was already moving toward the door again. Colonel, I'm taking my F-35 up for reconnaissance. If you want to court-martial me for that, you can get in line behind Captain Ramirez. Lieutenant, one more word and... Sir, the new voice belonged to Captain Morrison, one of the F-35 pilots who'd been forced to withdraw from the canyon earlier. Request permission to join Lieutenant Tran for search and rescue overwatch. We've got the fuel and ordnance for extended operations. Before Briggs could respond, Captain Walsh spoke up. Same here, sir. That A-10 pilot did what we couldn't do. Least we can do is return the favor. One by one, other voices joined the chorus. Drone operators who'd watched their sophisticated systems get jammed and neutralized. F-35 pilots who'd been forced to withdraw from combat zones where an A-10 had operated with impunity. Support personnel who'd listened to radio traffic describing the kind of close air support that had become legendary in military circles. Klein's voice cut through the discussion. Base, this is maintenance. GPS shows the beacon is stationary but transmitting. Pilot's either alive or the emergency systems are working correctly. Either way, we've got maybe 4 hours of battery life on that beacon. 4 hours to find and extract a pilot from hostile territory. 4 hours to coordinate a rescue mission that would require multiple aircraft, ground support, and medical evacuation capabilities. 4 hours to prove that the military didn't abandon its own, regardless of whether they'd followed orders. General Mercer was conferring quietly with his aides, probably calculating the political implications of various courses of action. A successful rescue would validate Lena's unauthorized mission, but also highlight the failure of conventional assets. An unsuccessful rescue would eliminate a problematic pilot, but also create a martyr for critics of modern military doctrine. Tran didn't wait for the political calculations to resolve. I'm launching in 5 minutes. Anyone who wants to provide support is welcome to join me. Lieutenant Tran, you are not authorized. Colonel, she's alive down there because she was willing to do the right thing instead of the authorized thing. I'm not going to let her die because we're too concerned with regulations to return the favor." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in front of the entire command staff. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Tran was essentially daring her superiors to court-martial half the wing for attempting to rescue a pilot who'd saved civilian lives. Mercer stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Colonel Briggs, prepare a search and rescue package, full authorization, priority tasking." "Sir, Captain Ramirez violated direct orders." "Captain Ramirez accomplished the mission when authorized assets failed to do so," Mercer cut him off. "The political optics of leaving her in enemy territory are unacceptable. Authorize the rescue." But even as the rescue mission began to take shape, everyone in the command center understood that this was about more than just retrieving a downed pilot. This was about the fundamental question of whether the military rewarded results or compliance, whether innovation was valued more than conformity. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, Captain Lena Roach Ramirez was about to become the center of a debate that would reshape how wars were fought. 27 minutes later, Tran's F-35 was airborne, leading a rescue package that included 2 more Lightning IIs, a medical evacuation helicopter, and enough firepower to level a small city. Below them, Henderson's convoy had reached safety, delivering 23 civilians to a secure area where they would eventually be processed for evacuation to countries where being an interpreter for NATO forces wasn't a death sentence. "Base, this is Pixie. I've got visual on the crash site. Aircraft appears intact, pilot appears to be mobile. She's signaling with a flare." The relief in Tran's voice was audible to everyone monitoring the frequency, but as the rescue helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Klein's voice crackled over the radio with a message that would be remembered long after the official after-action reports were filed. "Roach, this is Klein. The Beast brought you home, just like she always does. Don't you dare apologize for being right when everyone else was wrong." The conference room at Bagram Air Base felt like a courtroom, complete with a panel of senior officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Lena sat at a small table facing the board, her flight suit still bearing the stains and tears from her emergency landing 18 hours earlier. Her left arm was in a sling, a souvenir from the hard landing, but her eyes were clear and her expression was calm. Across from her, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez from the Judge Advocate General's office was reviewing a stack of documents that looked thick enough to choke a horse. To Martinez's left sat General Mercer, his expression unreadable. To her right, Colonel Briggs looked like a man who'd spent the night reconsidering his career choices. "Captain Ramirez," Martinez began, her voice carrying the formal tone of military justice, "you are here to provide testimony regarding the events of Operation Safe Passage, specifically your unauthorized departure from Bagram Air Base and subsequent combat operations in violation of direct orders. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" "Yes, ma'am." "For the record, please state your name, rank, and current assignment." "Captain Lena Ramirez, United States Air Force. Currently assigned to the 354th Fighter Squadron, Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan." Martinez consulted her notes. "Captain, on the date in question, you were specifically ordered to maintain standby status and not to engage in combat operations. Do you acknowledge receiving those orders?" "Yes, ma'am." Colonel Briggs was very clear that my A-10 was to remain grounded unless there was a catastrophic failure of all other assets. "And yet you took off without authorization and engaged enemy forces in direct violation of those orders." Lena met Martinez's eyes without flinching. "Yes, ma'am, I did." "Can you explain your reasoning for this decision?" Lena had spent the night in the base medical facility thinking about this moment, considering how to explain the difference between following orders and following her oath. She decided that the truth, unvarnished and direct, was the only approach that made sense. "Ma'am, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That oath doesn't include exceptions for bureaucratic convenience or political calculations. When American personnel and civilians under our protection were dying because our authorized assets couldn't do the job, I had a choice. Follow orders and watch good people die, or disobey orders and save lives. I chose to save lives." The room fell silent. Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably recognizing that Lena had just articulated the fundamental tension between military discipline and moral responsibility. Martinez made a note on her pad. Captain, are you suggesting that following lawful orders is optional when it conflicts with your personal judgment? No, ma'am. I'm saying that when following orders would result in unnecessary casualties, military officers have a responsibility to consider the intent behind those orders versus their literal interpretation. Quote. General Mercer leaned forward. Captain, explain what you mean by intent behind the orders. Lena had been hoping someone would ask that question. Sir, the intent of Operation Safe Passage was to evacuate civilians and UN personnel safely. The specific orders about asset utilization were tactical decisions meant to support that strategic objective. When the tactical decisions failed to support the strategic objective, continuing to follow them would have violated the intent of the mission. That's a very convenient interpretation, Briggs interjected, his voice tight with controlled anger. Military discipline requires following orders, not second-guessing superior officers. Sir, with respect, military effectiveness requires accomplishing the mission. In this case, the mission was to save lives, not to validate tactical assumptions. Martinez consulted another document. Captain, we have radio transcripts indicating that you explicitly refused direct orders to return to base while engaged in combat operations. How do you justify that level of insubordination? Before Lena could answer, the conference room door opened, and Major Amina Dawood entered, still wearing dusty civilian clothes from the evacuation. Behind her came Sergeant Henderson, his left leg in a walking cast, but his bearing unmistakably military. Ma'am, Henderson said, addressing Martinez, request permission to provide testimony relevant to Captain Ramirez's actions. Martinez looked at General Mercer, who nodded. Permission granted, Sergeant. Please state your name and position. Sergeant First Class Tariq Henderson, Convoy Security Team Leader for Operation Safe Passage. Ma'am, I was on the ground during the engagement in question. I can provide ground truth assessment of Captain Ramirez's actions and their impact on mission success. Proceed, Sergeant. Henderson's testimony was precise, professional, and devastating to the case against Lena. He described the convoy's tactical situation, the failure of drone surveillance and high-altitude air support, and the direct correlation between Lena's intervention and the survival of all 23 civilians. Ma'am, in my professional opinion, Captain Ramirez's actions were not only justified but necessary. Without her intervention, we would have sustained significant civilian casualties and possible mission failure. Quote, Major Dawood's testimony was equally compelling, focusing on the coordination between air and ground forces that had enabled the civilian evacuation. Captain Ramirez demonstrated exceptional situational awareness and tactical judgment. Her willingness to remain on station despite equipment failures and enemy action was directly responsible for the survival of multiple civilians, including 5 children. But the most unexpected testimony came from Lieutenant Tran, who entered the conference room with the determined expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision. Ma'am, request permission to provide testimony regarding the technological limitations that necessitated Captain Ramirez's intervention. Martinez looked surprised. Lieutenant Tran, you were not scheduled to testify. No, ma'am, but I believe my perspective is relevant to understanding why Captain Ramirez's actions were necessary. Tran's testimony was a systematic dismantling of the technological assumptions that had shaped the original mission plan. She described the sophisticated jamming equipment that had neutralized drone operations, the terrain limitations that prevented effective high-altitude engagement, and the simple reality that some combat situations required human judgment and low-altitude precision that no amount of technology could provide. Ma'am, I spent 3 years learning to operate the most advanced unmanned systems in the world, but when those systems failed, Captain Ramirez accomplished the mission using 40-year-old technology and superior pilot skills. That's not a failure of orders, it's validation of experience over assumptions. When Tran finished, the conference room was quiet, except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft operations. Martinez reviewed her notes while the panel of officers exchanged glances that suggested they were dealing with a more complex situation than they'd anticipated. Captain Ramirez, Martinez said finally, do you have anything to add to the testimony we've heard? Lena stood, her injured arm making the movement awkward but her voice steady. Ma'am, I've spent 12 years learning to fly close air support missions. I've studied the terrain, the tactics, and the technology. When I saw that convoy heading into perfect ambush terrain with inadequate air cover, I knew people were going to die unless someone was prepared to do what was necessary rather than what was authorized. Quote, she paused, looking each panel member in the eye. I don't regret disobeying orders. I regret that it was necessary. Our doctrine failed. Our technology failed. And our assumptions about modern warfare failed. But the mission succeeded because someone was willing to use proven methods when innovative methods proved inadequate. General Mercer made a note on his pad. Captain, what do you believe should be the outcome of these proceedings? Sir, I believe the military should focus on why authorized assets failed to accomplish the mission rather than why unauthorized assets succeeded. If the lesson learned from Operation Safe Passage is that pilots should follow orders regardless of tactical reality, then we're learning the wrong lesson. Martinez closed her folder and exchanged a long look with General Mercer. Captain Ramirez, you are dismissed while the panel deliberates. You will be notified of our findings within 24 hours. As Lena stood to leave, Henderson's voice carried across the room. Ma'am, for what it's worth, every soldier who was on that convoy would serve with Captain Ramirez again without hesitation. That's not the kind of recommendation you give to officers who make poor decisions. The door closed behind Lena with a sound like finality, but as she walked down the corridor toward an uncertain future, she could hear voices through the conference room door, not the formal tones of military justice, but the heated discussion of officers grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Questions about the difference between discipline and effectiveness, between innovation and tradition, between following orders and following conscience. Questions that would ultimately reshape how the Air Force thought about combat operations, pilot training, and the eternal tension between human judgment and technological capability. But those were conversations for generals and politicians. Lena had done her job, told the truth, and accepted the consequences of her choices. Whatever happened next, she could live with the decisions she'd made. 23 civilians were alive because she'd been willing to disobey orders when orders conflicted with reality. That was mathematics she could understand. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the flight line at Nellis Air Force Base in shades of gold and possibility. Captain Lena Roach Ramirez stood before a classroom full of young pilots, their flight suits crisp and their expressions eager. Behind her, a whiteboard bore the simple inscription, Advanced Tactical Reality School, Lesson 1. The students represented the best of a new generation, F-35 pilots, drone operators, and yes, even a few A-10 pilots who'd been quietly pulled from other assignments. They were smart, well-trained, and confident in their mastery of the world's most advanced weapons systems. They were also about to have their assumptions challenged. Welcome to Advanced Tactical Reality School, Lena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned her lessons in the crucible of actual combat. My name is Captain Ramirez, and I'm here to teach you the difference between simulation and survival. She gestured toward the A-10 visible through the classroom windows, its distinctive silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. How many of you have heard the story about the A-10 pilot who disobeyed orders to save a convoy in Afghanistan? Several hands went up, along with a few knowing smiles. The story had become something of a legend in Air Force circles, equal parts cautionary tale and inspiration, depending on who was telling it. Good. Now, how many of you think that pilot made the right decision? More hands, though some students looked uncertain about the implications of the question. And how many of you think that pilot should have been court-martialed for insubordination? A few hands rose tentatively. Lena nodded approvingly. Excellent. You're all thinking, which means we can have an intelligent discussion about why that pilot, who was me, by the way, ended up standing in front of you instead of sitting in Leavenworth. The classroom erupted in whispers and sideways glances. Several students looked like they'd just realized they were in the presence of a celebrity, while others appeared to be reconsidering their career choices. Lieutenant Chloe Tran entered from the side door, her instructor's badge gleaming on her flight suit. She'd requested transfer to the new school after completing her investigation of drone system vulnerabilities, research that had led to significant upgrades in electronic warfare protection and backup communication protocols. Good morning, class. I'm Lieutenant Tran, and I'll be your co-instructor for this course. Before you ask, yes, I was the drone operator who watched Captain Ramirez accomplish the mission when my sophisticated systems failed completely. And yes, I learned more about combat effectiveness in 30 minutes of watching her work than I'd learned in 3 years of technical training. Lena smiled at her colleague and co-conspirator. Tran had become something of a zealot for practical training after the Afghanistan incident, pushing for realistic scenarios that tested pilot judgment as much as technical proficiency. The purpose of this school, Lena continued, is not to make you disobey orders. The purpose is to make you so competent, so prepared, and so tactically sound that your superiors will trust your judgment when reality doesn't match the plan. She walked to the whiteboard and wrote a single word: readiness. Every pilot in this room has been trained to operate the most advanced aircraft in the world. You can execute complex maneuvers, employ sophisticated weapons systems, and coordinate with other platforms in ways that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago. But technology is only as good as the pilot using it, and situations don't always conform to the parameters we've programmed into our computers. The rear door of the classroom opened and Master Sergeant Klein entered, his weathered face breaking into a familiar grin. He'd followed Lena to Nellis, along with several other experienced maintainers who'd volunteered for the new school. Behind him, a figure in civilian clothes raised a tentative hand. "Captain Ramirez, may I observe the class?" Lena's expression softened as she recognized Major Amina Dawood, now working with the State Department on military-civilian cooperation protocols. "Of course, Major." "Class, this is Major Dawood, who coordinated civilian evacuation during the mission we've been discussing. She can provide perspective on what combat operations look like from the ground." As Dawood took a seat in the back row, the classroom door opened once more. Sergeant Henderson entered on crutches, his retirement papers processed, but his interest in military training undiminished. He'd become an unofficial consultant to the school, providing ground force perspective on close air support operations. "Now then," Lena said, turning back to the class, "who can tell me why an A-10 was more effective than F-35s and drones in the scenario we discussed?" A young pilot raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, was it because the A-10 is designed for close air support?" "Partially correct, but incomplete." "Lieutenant Marsh, what do you think?" Quote, "Ma'am, was it because the pilot had more experience with that type of mission?" "Getting warmer. Anyone else?" Tran stepped forward. "The A-10 was more effective because Captain Ramirez was prepared for the mission that actually happened, not the mission that was planned. She understood the terrain, anticipated the limitations of other systems, and had trained for exactly the kind of scenarios that everyone else considered unlikely." Lena nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Readiness isn't just about knowing how to operate your aircraft. It's about understanding the full spectrum of possible scenarios and being prepared for the ones that don't appear in the textbooks." She wrote another word on the whiteboard: judgment. Technology can provide information, but it can't provide wisdom. Computers can calculate probabilities, but they can't make moral decisions. When Captain Morrison's F-35 couldn't engage targets without risking civilian casualties, he demonstrated excellent judgment by recognizing the limitations of his platform. When Lieutenant Tran's drones were jammed, she demonstrated excellent judgment by immediately seeking alternative solutions. "But ma'am," one of the students interjected, "what about following orders?" Military discipline requires accomplishing the mission while minimizing casualties and collateral damage," Lena interrupted. "Sometimes that means following orders exactly as written. Sometimes it means using initiative and judgment to accomplish the intent behind the orders when circumstances change." Henderson spoke from the back of the room. "From a ground perspective, I can tell you that troops care more about results than process. When someone's shooting at you, you want air support from pilots who are focused on solving the tactical problem, not on covering their asses with paperwork." Klein nodded in agreement. "And from a maintenance perspective, aircraft are just tools. The most sophisticated fighter in the world is useless if the pilot doesn't have the judgment to employ it effectively when conditions change." Lena turned back to the whiteboard and wrote a third word: responsibility. "Each of you will face situations where you have to choose between what's easy and what's right, between what's authorized and what's necessary. The purpose of this school is to prepare you for those moments by teaching you to think tactically, plan comprehensively, and execute decisively." Quote. She gestured toward the A-10 visible through the windows. "That aircraft saved 23 lives, not because it's the most advanced platform in our inventory, but because it was flown by someone who understood her responsibility to the people depending on her. Technology changes, but the fundamental responsibility of military pilots remains constant. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, accomplish the mission, and bring everyone home alive. Major Dawood raised her hand. Captain, what advice would you give to pilots who find themselves in similar situations? Lena considered the question carefully. Be so prepared, so competent, and so tactically sound that when you do have to make difficult decisions, everyone around you will trust that you're making them for the right reasons. Study your craft, understand your equipment, and never forget that the ultimate measure of military effectiveness is not how well you follow procedures, but how well you accomplish the mission. She turned to the whiteboard one final time and wrote, Lesson 1. Never underestimate the pilot who was ready when everyone else failed. The classroom fell silent as students absorbed the implications of what they'd heard. This wasn't just about flying techniques or weapons employment. This was about the fundamental philosophy of military service, about the tension between innovation and tradition, between compliance and effectiveness. Tran stepped forward. Your first assignment is to study a historical case where military success required individual initiative that went beyond standard doctrine. Analyze the decision-making process, the tactical situation, and the long-term implications. We'll discuss your findings next week. As the students filed out, chattering among themselves about the unconventional nature of their new curriculum, Lena remained at the whiteboard, staring at the words she'd written. Behind her, she could hear the familiar sounds of Klein preparing aircraft for training flights, Henderson discussing ground support requirements with Tran, and Dawood reviewing civilian protection protocols. It had been 6 months since her unauthorized flight into the Khyber Pass. 6 months since she'd proven that sometimes the oldest solutions were the most effective ones. The formal investigation had concluded with a letter of reprimand for failure to follow proper authorization procedures and a commendation for exceptional performance under combat conditions. The contradictory nature of the official response had become something of a joke among Air Force personnel. Get punished and rewarded for the same action. But the real victory wasn't the commendation, or even the survival of 23 civilians. The real victory was this classroom, this school, and the opportunity to teach a new generation of pilots that readiness was more valuable than any technology, that judgment was more important than any procedure, and that the willingness to do what was right when everyone else was doing what was safe would always be the difference between good pilots and great ones. Outside, another class was beginning pre-flight instruction on the A-10s that had been quietly transferred to Nellis, despite repeated attempts to retire the platform. The aircraft were old, loud, and completely unfashionable by modern military standards. They were also ready for anything, just like the pilots who flew them. Epilogue. From Modern Military Aviation, Lessons from the Afghan Withdrawal. By General William Mercer, Rhetoric, published by the Air Force Historical Foundation. The events of Operation Safe Passage fundamentally changed how the United States Air Force approaches pilot training and tactical employment. Captain Lena Ramirez's unauthorized intervention, while controversial at the time, demonstrated critical gaps in our understanding of close air support operations in complex terrain. The establishment of the Advanced Tactical Reality School at Nellis Air Force Base represents the institutionalization of lessons learned from Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflicts where technological superiority alone proved insufficient for mission success. The school's emphasis on pilot judgment, tactical flexibility, and comprehensive readiness has produced a generation of aviators better prepared for the complexities of modern warfare. Perhaps most significantly, the school's curriculum acknowledges that military effectiveness sometimes requires individual initiative that transcends standard procedures. This represents a fundamental shift from the compliance-based training that characterized much of the post-Cold War period to a more nuanced approach that balances discipline with tactical judgment. Captain Ramirez continued as chief instructor at the school until her promotion to major and subsequent assignment to Air Combat Command, where she now shapes tactical doctrine for close air support operations. Lieutenant Tran, promoted to captain, serves as deputy commander of the Unmanned Systems Integration Program, focusing on human-machine coordination in complex operational environments. The A-10 platform, which many experts predicted would be retired after Afghanistan, received renewed funding and modernization support following comprehensive analysis of its unique capabilities in contested environments. As one maintenance chief noted, sometimes the best technology is the technology that works when everything else fails. The civilian evacuation coordinated by Major Dawood became a model for military humanitarian cooperation, with her protocols now standard training for all Air Force personnel involved in evacuation operations. Sergeant Henderson's ground perspective analysis contributed significantly to improvements in air-ground coordination procedures. But perhaps the most important legacy of Operation Safe Passage is its demonstration that military excellence requires more than technical proficiency. It requires the wisdom to know when rules must be followed and when they must be transcended in service of higher principles. In the words of Captain Ramirez's final instructor evaluation, some pilots follow orders, some pilots follow procedures. Great pilots follow their oath to protect and defend, regardless of what that requires. The distinction, it turns out, makes all the difference. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.